Hey everyone, I'm Nigel. I'm CEO of Publicis Sapient, and I'm happy to be talking to you today about digital business transformation. So I'm going to start by moving to a quote from George Westerman at MIT, and Publicis Sapient. And Sapient was founded just outside the MIT campuses. And it's a fantastic quote because so many people use this word digital transformation. And when it's done right, it's like a caterpillar turning into a butterfly. When done wrong, all you have is a really fast caterpillar. And I love this quote because it talks about the fact that you want the outcome and the change to be transformational, whilst often the journey to get there needs to be incremental. But you have to be really thoughtful about how you actually really transform and don't just end up with a fast caterpillar. So in order to do that, you really have to start examining change. And when you examine change, what you see is the kind of two forms of change, linear and exponential. And of course, I don't need to remind anybody that we're living in a form and experiencing exponential change, because in nature, everything that is good, babies are born, plants are all absolutely exponential. Are all linear, and actually everything that is exponential is bad. So think about tumors and viruses and volcanoes. They're all exponential. So we're conditioned over thousands and hundreds of thousands of years to deal with linear change, but exponential change we're not so good at. So when you go forward to bring this to life, I'm going to use a simple example. Some of you may have been to the place where this picture is taken. This is the American Museum of Natural History in New York. And if you've ever been here, this is the Roosevelt Rotunda. And this exhibit that you see in front of you here is the Borosaurus. At about 50 feet tall, it's the world's largest freestanding exhibit. Now, put yourself in this room, picture yourself there, and imagine that you have a drop of water dropping from the ceiling. It's dripping, and it's dripping at a linear rate. So 1 drop, 2 drops, 3 drops, 4 drops, and so on. At a linear rate, it would take 752,000 years to fill up this entire room. 752,000 years, remember that number. But what if we actually make that rate exponential? So 1 drop, 2 drops, 4 drops, 8 drops. How long do you think it takes now? It takes 38 minutes. And this is why I wanted to bring you into a physical space to kind of really, we all understand exponential as a concept. But what's shocking is something at a linear rate that would take 752,000 years takes 38 minutes. But what's even more shocking is it took 33 minutes for the water to get to its ankles, and only 5 minutes for it to be completely underwater. So imagine today what businesses and we're all experiencing. The water is at our feet, at our ankles, and in 5 minutes, that entire room is underwater. Imagine how quickly you would react if you were there. And that is what we face in business today, because if you look on the left here, this is Blockbuster. And I'm sure many of you remember Blockbuster in most of North America and Western Europe. It was the chain video rental and DVD rental store that dominated video and DVD rentals and took over all of the mom and pop shops that did that. And on the right, you have Netflix, which disrupted Blockbuster, but started out as a mail order DVD business. So it basically said the job you have to go to the video store and return a movie and collect a new one, we're going to eliminate that because we're going to send it to your house. And now you can just drop it off at any post box. So it's reducing that last mile. But Netflix realized that if they did what Blockbuster did and became the mail order DVD company, they would be disrupted. So they had to disrupt themselves, and very quickly shifted the entire business model, the capability, the technology to become a streaming company. And at that time, their stock price took a huge hit when they were doing that. But they made that shift. And then again, they made that shift to avoid becoming a dumb pipe when they actually started to get to streaming and making content that was bespoke to them. So they went from mail order to streaming to now streaming their own content. And today, of course, we all know it's the largest content producer in the world, right? And that shows you how exponentially shifting is so much more complex and harder and happens at a much faster pace. So why is this happening, right? Well, technology is the obvious answer. There's huge amounts of technological change in the world, and countries that are mastering technology are hugely important because it's the driver of so much of what we experience on a day-to-day basis. The next is behavioral change, right? So behavioral change is our behavior as human beings. So people using devices, using, computers, kids, all you have to do is look around you, older people in the context of the pandemic, all of us have shifted our behavior. I mean, the fact that we're having an entire conference on Zoom tells you how much our behaviors are shifting, because our behaviors are adapted to the technology that is at our disposal. And while that has been true for many, many years, what's now starting to happen is the rate of technological change is improving and increasing. And so our behaviors are changing faster. And to support both of these, we see new business models. And new business models are now starting to create funding and opportunity to scale new businesses in the context of this technological and behavioral change. And finally, we're seeing societal change. And what you start to see is when you bring all of these things together, technological change, behavioral change, business models, societal change, you now create complexity of a pretty significant amount in order for us and businesses to manage, because all of these four forces of change act as a platform effect. They effectively are all helping us accelerate the change so that the rate of change and the scale of change seems significantly greater than we've experienced in the past. So now for a second, we use this word digital, right? So I want to kind of zero in specifically on digitally native companies. So companies that were founded entirely in the context of those four forces of change that I'm talking about. What did they do particularly well? First, they really devise very clear ideas about what problem they're solving. They don't have the challenges of most legacy businesses having evolved for 100 or 200 years. And you will actually start to see some of the businesses that were created in a digital era have to start to, this challenge in some of the bigger ones probably have that today. But when they start, for the most part, they're very clear on what need or problem they're solving. They understand the value to customers, their customers, and also to themselves as a business. So they understand that value exchange. What value are we creating? And what value does it create for us? So they're very clear on the need, the value to the customer, and value to business. And then what they do is they focus very heavily on designing the experience. So really being obsessive about the actual experience of somebody using their product or their service. They're powered by engineering. And I use engineering specifically to delineate from this old world idea of IT, which was about risk and cost. But engineering is about how do I use technology to bring products and services and experiences to life. And finally, they're refined using data and AI. So they're constantly refining this idea of data and AI. And that's, incredibly critical. Now, most companies, will acknowledge this, right? The inconvenient truth there is that most companies are great at their core business. And by the way, that holds true for even the advertising and marketing businesses, right? They're great at their core businesses, but they're not great at reimagining the future of their business. And the reason for that is so often when you look at a digital business like this iPhone here, you look at what's on the screen. You look at what's on the screen, but what you've got to realize is what's on the screen is a small part of what makes this company what it is. It looks like it's just an app, but underneath the water, like this iceberg here, is where all of the innovation and all of the complexity that you have to transform if you want to make that experience on the glass or above the glass, as I call it, seamless. And so how do you do that, right? In my book, I talk about this idea of the speed capabilities. And SPEED is an acronym deliberately designed to help you move faster as an organization, but each of the letters of the acronym talk about a specific capability. So the first is strategy, being really clear about what strategy and hypotheses and value pools you're going to prioritize and focus on, right? How are you going to unlock value? Then this idea of product, where you don't think about a project, but you think about a product, where a product is something that's constantly evolving at pace and at scale. The E is experience. How can you enable value for customers and really help them drive that? The next E is engineering, delivering on your promise at pace and at scale, right? Really focusing on how you bring those experiences to life. And finally, data and AI, where you're constantly validating and refining your hypotheses and iterating your business. So it's not static, you're constantly evolving. And if you bring these speed capabilities together in an organization, our belief is that this allows you to compete in a world that is increasingly digital and extraordinarily competitive along the same dimensions. But then, if let's assume you have all of these capabilities and you build them, right? I think you then have to answer two questions, which are very obvious, right? Like where to play and how to win. And you've got to be really clear about what you're trying to do as a business. Are you trying to defend your existing orientation and your existing product, service, markets with the best practices that you have? Are you trying to differentiate, potentially enter new markets and new audiences, or change and differentiate from the people that you traditionally compete with? Or are you going to disrupt, where you create entirely new markets and entirely new audiences with new business structures, business models, payment mechanisms, right? And if you think about the likes of Netflix, to go from a mail order DVD business to then build a company that has the competency, the capability around streaming. And then finally, again, go and become the largest content producer in the world is a huge set of shifts. And it's a huge set of shifts in the company, which is the stuff that is under the iceberg. But it's also a huge set of shifts in the context of the market and how you're positioned and who you're competing against. So Netflix at the beginning of my story was competing against Blockbuster. And Netflix today is competing against a very different set of companies who would never have thought of Netflix as a competitor 5 years ago, let alone 10 years ago, right? And that gives you the sense of how these choices of where to defend, where to differentiate, and where to disrupt are incredibly critical in the context of how you actually begin your transformation journey. So going back to that caterpillar idea, you don't end up with a faster caterpillar, but you actually end up with a butterfly. So just a couple words on my book. And the reason I wrote the book is I feel like the world desperately now has so many established companies, and ultimately all of these established companies who've been there for hundreds of years in some cases need to find a way to sustain competitive advantage from now to the next. And that journey from now to next is going to be powered by how they get to grips with this world of digital and digital business transformation, not just digital in the context of, effectively a piece of technology or part of the business. Because I think so often digital in marketing circles gets reduced to technology, or digital in marketing gets reduced to digital marketing. And these are, of course, tools and aspects of digital. But the real opportunity for digital is to fundamentally shift businesses in ways that companies can leverage their unique strengths. And I'm going to give you an example in a minute of a client we work with to give you a sense of what that's like. I mean, this is just some of the folks that have talked about the book. So this is one of our clients, Arne Sorensen, who was the CEO of Marriott, and unfortunately passed away only, over the last couple of months. But he talks about Publicis Sapient's experience and expertise in the digital space, helping transform Marriott. And Marriott launched Homes and Villas, which was a platform-based business to allow them to take on Airbnb and VRBO and create a new business opportunity in the context of homes and villas and getting new inventory so that they move from being a hotel company to a travel company. You have some of the other folks here like Alan Joe, Unilever CEO, Mike Sievert, Hiroshi Ishii, who's the director of the MIT Media Labs. And then, of course, a lot of the big Silicon Valley companies like Google and Shantanu at Adobe and Parker. And we think about all of these kinds of technology companies as part of the ecosystem, because one of the big shifts in digital is there used to be this idea where companies felt like they could do it all themselves and we could do everything ourselves. And the reality is most successful digital transformations are part of an ecosystem with Alexa, Salesforce, and Adobe and Google will partner with each other in some areas, compete with each other in other areas. And the job of a company like ours is how do you bring these things together to ultimately create value? So now I'm going to close on an example. I'm going to start the story with, a company that I'm sure is familiar to many of you, right? Disney. So as you know, if you go back and look only a few years ago, Disney's stock price was challenged. They've been fighting through a lot of the traditional ways, theme parks, new movies. They were acquiring content at a crazy pace, but they were supplying that content to all of the platforms out there, whether it was Amazon or Netflix. And Disney was a great content company, which dominated the box office, built a lot of successful movie studios. And they've been experimenting from a project perspective in Disney. They had Hulu, they had ESPN Plus, they had a few of these, but these were not transformative. They were pilots and they were testing things out. And then they made a big shift, which is basically, they'd seen significant losses, of over $1 billion in these experiments, but they believed that they'd learned enough about now starting to become a platform business. So they launched Disney Plus. And Disney Plus required them to make a huge commitment, right? A commitment that basically needed them to effectively take almost, one of their biggest sources of revenue of 150 million from Netflix, and cease licensing well before they launched it, right? And of course, Disney is now spending even more on original content versus Netflix in order to fuel their platform effect. And what's interesting is when we partner with Disney to kind of go on this journey, Disney's plan was to reach somewhere in the region of about 40 million subscribers in 5 years. And Disney reached 100 million subscribers in 16 months, which took Netflix 20 years. Now, both the successes and the challenges are created by those same forces that I was talking about. So Disney clearly benefited from the fact that if you look at the timing of the launch of Disney Plus, it was just before the pandemic. And of course, it continued to accelerate over the course of the pandemic. And that first year really soared, its growth at an exponential rate. But now what you have is Disney, a company that was an established business, betting its future on a platform-based business model, which brings in new customers, 100 million of them, into that Disney ecosystem that allows them to now look at how these customers are consuming data firsthand, not intermediated by Netflix or Amazon, and start to understand how these customers are actually going to continue to evolve. And so when you think about this transformation, it's not only responded much better to the pandemic because, obviously it had theme parks and cruises that were all shut down, but its unique insight that it got into its customers and this new platform-based business model meant that its market cap scaled dramatically over the course of this time. And that for me is the power of what we've seen Disney do, which is as we move to the kind of next slide, you start to really see that it created something that was greater than the sum of its parts. It added $32 billion in market value, and forecasted that its subscribers will triple in that time period, right? And so you start to now recognize that this was an incredible transformation of a business that has embraced so many of the principles that I'm talking about in the context of a world that is increasingly digital. And because I started my story with Netflix, now you see an established business that today I feel like is probably one of the best examples of an established business competing. And so I think I'm almost at time, and I'm going to wrap here. So thank you all for listening, and I'll stop there.